Hey everybody, welcome to The Bottom Line. Michael Noland here, and today I wanted to discuss my top 5 bass players in rock. Now, the second I decided to do a video on bass players, I knew I was in trouble, especially if I'm only going to introduce my top 5 favorite bass players. And a lot of my favorite bass players are not on this top 5 list. But you know, these are the bass players that have most influenced me, pleased me as a listener, and have done more for me in a total general musical sense than even some of the finest bass players in rock. For those of you who don't know, I'm also a bassist, and so this list is very near and dear to my heart. And number 5 was a tough one to name. A couple of names came up, Pastore, Clark, and I have to give it to Clark. Now, it's not that Stanley Clark is a better bassist, but I was introduced to him first. Return to Forever, and some of the lines and his ability to actually jam live. Well, you all know what I feel about Led Zeppelin being a bit of a jam band themselves, always changing their material when they performed live. And I think it's just the fact that Stanley Clark just opened up a whole lot for me as a musician. He introduced this whole idea of jazz, rock, fusion kind of approach to music, and so that's why I chose Stanley Clark in my top 5 bassist list. Up next, a bassist from one of the top bands in rock and roll, no doubt, and a man who never took a back seat even to their magnificent drummer, Mr. John Entwistle. When I think of the rhythm section of Keith Moon and John Entwistle, any other bassist would have been buried by this drummer. But it's not only Entwistle's ability to keep up with Moon, it's also his syncopation and his syncopation approach that really intrigued me early on. Now, I didn't even know that he could possibly play this stuff live until, of course, I saw The Who at the Cow Palace during the Quadrophenia tour. That, of course, was the infamous performance where Keith Moon passed out after getting into a tussle with one of the band members. I couldn't believe what I saw, and it was really a wild night. But you know what? What I was very impressed with that night was the punch-through sound that John Entwistle was able to do even live, filling the room with a plethora of notes in any given 16th, 30-second combination. Now, number 3, of course, if you've seen any of my videos, I've just recently announced that Squire from Yes is my 3rd favorite bassist of all time. Now, I explained a lot of my reasonings in that video, but this man is a virtuoso, no doubt. I also mentioned in that video that I've heard some people refer to him as a lead guitar bassist, which is ridiculous. And for a further explanation for my choice, at number 3, take a look at my video introducing Yes. All right, that leads up to number 2, and I haven't ever officially announced this on the channel, although I think I've hinted at it. My number 2 bassist of all time is Mr. John Paul Jones of Led Zeppelin. This man could play as many notes as Entwistle any day, but his mixes are often more subdued. But man, on some of their live performances, the things he does, the punch, the triplets delivered, the almost impossible bass licks to replicate. And of course, it's not just him as a bass player, but it's also the fact that he is a multi-instrumentalist. This gives him an idea of where instruments should fit into a mix. And as I've said many times, John Paul Jones is Led Zeppelin's secret weapon. Of course, that leads to number 1, and it may not surprise any of you that I have chosen Sir Paul McCartney as my favorite bass player of all time. Now, it's not just because of his riffing capabilities, although Paul is a fine bass riffer, there is no doubt about that. But as to whether he's on the actual level of some of the bass players I've already mentioned, that's debatable. But I can tell you, he is an ultra fine bass player, and he has done more for the instrument, the bass guitar, in pop music than any other man alive, in my opinion. His melodic approach was absolutely new. And as I already expressed in my video covering their very first album, Please Please Me, that even in those very early recordings, the Beatles show that they have arrived with a completely professional bass player, top of his game, the day he walked into Abbey Road Studios. And of course, I covered 5 videos just covering Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, and you know my feelings on how he approached almost painting his bass stroke by stroke onto that album after the fact. No, I'm sorry, Sir Paul has to be at the top of the heap, and he always has been for me.